Well, hello everyone, it's John Laughland here. I'm the Director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to be joined by Jeremy Nell, my co-host from Cape Town, and by Slobodan Despot, an old friend who joins us from Switzerland. We're talking today about the similarities between the European Union and the Soviet Union. This is a comparison that has been made many times to me personally, and many times by other people in public. I think the first person to make it was probably the Soviet dissident and expatriate Vladimir Bukovsky, who started making this comparison at least 20 years ago. I've certainly made it many times myself, and lots of people have made it to me. Most recently, I think, in St. Petersburg, where a professor of political science told me that she thought the European Union was not just like the Soviet Union, but was much worse than the Soviet Union. I've also had it from people who live not in the Soviet Union, but in the Warsaw Pact countries. I'm thinking in particular of President Václav Klaus of the Czech Republic, who made that comparison to me in an email and said that I was being naive because I didn't understand, unlike the people in Central and Eastern Europe, they could see perfectly well what was going on in Europe. We were discussing Europe's totalitarian drift. But as I say, I've had this comparison made many times to me, and it's almost becoming a platitude. But I wanted to get Slobodan Despot on the show because he's been reading among other things, some of the memoirs of people who lived through the early years of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'm interested in Slobodan's view because he is a man of letters. He is, yes, a political commentator, but also a novelist and somebody who, as I'm sure we'll see shortly, is very steeped in literature. When I compare the European Union to the Soviet Union, I think personally of the late Soviet Union. In other words, the soft stage, the, let's say, Khrushchev and Brezhnev stage, the stage where there were very few, if any, political prisoners, where the whole Stalinist repression and so on, or even Leninist repression, had more or less slackened off. But if I understand you correctly, Slobodan, because we've exchanged a bit about this on WhatsApp, you have noticed similarities, I think, even with the very early years of the Bolshevik regime. Go ahead, Slobodan. You're on mute at the moment. You need to unmute your mic. We can't hear you. There we go.
Here we go. Oh, excuse me. I'm not
That's
very
fine.
fluent in these things. Well, thank you for inviting me, and I've heard your question very well. And let me just give a few credentials so you know where I'm speaking from. I'm a Swiss citizen, but of Serbian origin, and I was born in a post-Soviet country in the Tito's Yugoslavia. And then as you know, John, I've worked for many years in a famous publishing house, L'Age in Lausanne, which was worldly known for publishing a great number of East European authors, writers, dissidents as well. And at that time, I was the translator and I would say friend of Alexander Zinoviev, who, in my view, has described in the most accurate and cold-minded way the Soviet type of society. To discover in 1976, when he was expelled from the USSR himself to Germany, that USSR was also there. So he left the USSR and he landed in a sort of USSR. So, but let's go to the point and the origins. Actually, we do remember the Soviet system as somewhat, inefficient, dumb, but in the end, the final years quite benevolent. It was not such a harsh regime. I give you an example. Well, it was actually, and it did not need to be terribly, violent after all the violence it had been through. People had understood how to behave. But when our philosopher, oh, you just disappeared, John. Oh yes, okay, it's all right. When Alexander Zinoviev, who was a professor of sociology and of logics, he began having troubles for his writings, which were very frank about the nature of Soviet system, and writings, essays that were even unacceptable for the Western public, who was left-oriented at that time, pro-Soviet oriented, pro-communist oriented. When he was being bullied in the university by the Communist Party, one of his colleagues wrote a very, very fierce letter to the administration and the party, saying, "Are you fools? Are you such fools that you cannot see the type of person you are now bullying and trying to expel? He's one of our most valuable scientists." So what do I mean? When such things happen today, in today's Europe, to scientists, to professors, we've seen that occur very often in the COVID years. Nobody stands up in such a way because they are even more frightened than the Soviet scholars of that time. They're more frightened. There's nobody coming out. So, well, that's the period. We know about the Stalinist times essentially from Solzhenitsyn and other witnesses, but we know very little about the first years of the Bolshevik regime. There was a period of, as you know, of civil war, which is not entirely a civil war because it involved also the Western powers, who tried to not as much to help the old regime, the Tsar, maintain his power, which was lost, as much as to try to grab a part of the Russian land. But this did not work. They lost, and then once the Bolsheviks consolidated their power, they began they began implementing a policy that was called the New Economic Policy, the NEP, which was actually liberal. I mean, liberal in the leftist sense, but not totalitarian as we would see it today. The private property was to some point allowed. There were all sorts of interesting and quite silly experiments in education, in science, in culture, of course, in feminism and whatever. And it was quite a jolly period until the 30s with the Stalinist takeover. But one could argue that the true nature of the Bolshevik regime had been betrayed by the Stalinist authoritarian and to some point nationalist policies of revolution in one single country, which was the Stalin doctrine, instead of spreading the Bolshevik revolution to the whole world, which was the Leninist doctrine. And so the 20s and 30s in Soviet Russia were a period of experimenting, of ideological. It was an ideological lab and a scientific lab and also a cultural lab for all the things, all the theories and ideologies that were then implemented in our part of Europe. No difference. You can, well, maybe I'm being a little bit, square, but there are books. There are. As you said at the beginning, John. I don't know if you hear me, but I'll go on. Jerem, you're on.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
All right. There was those memoirs, John, you told me about. There were the memoirs of this writer and poetess, Zinaida Gippius, who was the wife of a very well-known Russian philosopher, Merezhkovsky. She wrote about the first months of Bolshevik power in Petersburg, Petrograd then. Well, yeah, John, we're losing you. I hope you hear me.
Yeah, well, I'm still, yeah.
Yeah. It showed the very nature of the Bolshevik power.
I know.
These writings show the very nature of the Bolshevik power as a violent power, a wild force, but a very utterly incompetent force, not serious at all, and very corrupt. So we used to have the idea that the first Bolsheviks, the original Bolshevik regime, was a sort of Roman-like virtuous regime. It's not the case. They were just as corrupt as the corruption that we are seeing right now. So the first, as a French journalist traveling to Moscow in the 20s, Henri Béraud stated in a book that made him very famous because he was a companion of the Communist Party until he went there. And what he wrote in Ce que j'ai vu à Moscou, what I saw in Moscow, is a thing that he summarized in a single sentence. The old bourgeoisie was hanged for the new bourgeoisie to grab her slippers, more or less. So you have the new Bolsheviks in furs with their girlfriends, usually dancers from the theaters, grabbing the power, drinking the remaining champagne, and all these things that do not look at all like a virtuous revolution Robespierre type. It's just a grab of power.
So what you're saying, so if you don't mind me jumping in there, what you're saying is that both the Bolsheviks and the European Union have what you would call a democratic deficit.
To say the least.
I mean, they're both bureaucracies in which the people have no power.
Yes, well, following my, if I may say so, my master Alexander Zinoviev, I tend to look at these things in a functional and structural way. Zinoviev would say that ideology is a structure that doesn't care about its own contents. Contents of an ideology doesn't really matter. It can be the war of the classes, the struggle of classes, the proletarian cult, or it can be wokeism. It doesn't matter at all. The structures are always the same. And one of the structures that we are seeing we have been seeing, well, since the beginning in the European Union, is a form of functional, of functional determination. You create a function, and then the contents of the function or the missions fulfilled by the function appear. That's exactly what the founders of the EU used to say. I think it's that Frenchman.
Would you say that their intentions were noble?
No. Intentions, first of all, the founders of the EU were technocrats. Technocrats do not do not think, I think, in moral or even in ethical terms. They think in functional terms. We want to unify the continent. We want to, to merge it in one single unit. By the way, the end of the sentence is one single unit because so we can rule in a more centralized way. So, instead of having
so both the Soviets and the EU are expansionist.
The Soviets were expansionist actually until Stalin's years. Then Stalin's expansion or limited expansion, I would say, took over the patterns of the former Russian Empire. He would expand only to, strategically, geographically, but he did not mind to spread the revolution. Whereas his mindset and his considerations when the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact were of a geopolitical nature, not of an ideological nature. He wanted to have a buffer zone, that's all. Whereas the EU, as you see, when you see the leaders behaving the way they do, is riddled with a sort of ideological messianism. They want to teach the whole world how to think, how to behave, how to speak, how to do the trade. They have, the first thing they do when they go abroad, especially, the strange figure ruling France today, is to give lessons to other people, to other countries. This is an ideological posture. After the Second World War, you almost would never hear a Soviet head of state or diplomat giving any lessons of an ideological type to any foreign ruler or country. They would just promote or defend their strategic interests. That was all.
I'm really sorry to have had these connection problems again. So I've missed a few minutes of what you've been saying. But you've, as it happens, at the moment I've come back online, you said something that I was going to raise, which is the question of ideology. Maybe you've developed this point already. You know very well, Slobodan, that this was something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn makes very forcefully, a point he makes very forcefully in the letter to the Soviet leaders from 1973, I think it is, where he says the worst aspect of the Soviet regime was not the material shortages, was not the rather grimy lifestyle. It was instead the ideology and the absolutely obsessive lies, this tissue of lies which the whole system was based on. I've often thought of and quoted that passage because that is indeed the characteristic of our time, isn't it? The empire, what Putin called the empire of lies. Of course, it was very much a feature of the Soviet system. You say that Soviet leaders didn't give ideological instructions to foreign leaders. That is true, but of course, the ideology remained the structuring element, didn't it, of the regime itself, even though people didn't believe in it. I think that the situation is worse because I think in the final years in the last decades, let's say, of the Soviet system, they probably didn't believe in it much themselves. Some of them may have done, but not all of them. The famous Václav Havel shopkeeper who puts in his essay, The Power of the Powerless, he puts a sign in his window saying, "Workers of the world unite," or whatever. And Havel says, well, he doesn't really believe that. He just knows he has to do it. I think the situation is worse, surely, in Europe, because I think most people do believe the ideology. And I think that we in Western Europe, unlike the Soviets, have not developed the antibodies. The Russians and the other Central and Eastern Europeans understood the regime to be hostile. They understood the regime to be a bad regime. And at home, famously around the kitchen table, they were able to say what they thought. But around the kitchen table, well, firstly, people don't eat around the kitchen table in Western Europe anymore because they like the Americans, they just have fast food or whatever. But there isn't even that, I don't think, in European society. Of course, there are dissident families, dissident groups or whatever, yes. But I get the impression that in the Soviet period, there was a well-developed, what we should probably call civil society.
Yeah, actually, yes.
Perhaps not constituted, but certainly, as I say, in the private sphere. But liberalism has, I'm sure you won't disagree with me, has surely been far more corrosive, I think, of people's brains, really, than even communism was, precisely because people never regarded, or very seldom anyway, regarded the communist regime as friendly. They regarded it as an enemy. But most Europeans don't regard, the European Union or their national regimes as hostile. They believe in them.
Yeah. Well, there are several reasons for that. First of all, you are right. The Soviet leaders, they knew that they were aware of the limits of their own illusion. Their illusion was useful and necessary to rule the country, to rule their own society, but it was not exportable anymore. That's what Stalin himself said when he declared, it was in the 30s already. Now the revolution will be implemented in one single country, ours, and then we'll see. So there was a sort of split in them, split in the minds. Once one rhetorics were for their own people, one was for the real world. But whereas here we are beginning to understand now that our populations, our peoples in the western part of Europe have probably been more thoroughly and more constantly brainwashed than the Soviet citizens. Because,
so,
yeah.
You talk about illusion, and
yeah.
That's absolutely key. Again, I'm sure you and certainly I have been saying for years now that illusion is the single most important aspect, I would say, of Western policy, is the controlling the narrative, controlling the virtual
yes, you're
reality.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think that Western governments do much else except control the narrative or try to control it. I'm thinking, of course, of the sanctions measures and the various censorship measures and the threats of censorship, the terror of the social networks and all the rest of it. So they develop. They have got into a system now where that's basically all they're doing. But what is the illusion? In the case of the Soviet Union, we know what the illusion was. It was rather charming. It was people in factories, sometimes going on May Day marches, producing, with amazing productivity, Stakhanovite statistics, carrying banners, building socialism. And then, of course, the friendship of peoples, that was another illusion. And today, obviously, in Russia, people look back on those rather childlike illusions with some fondness. But what is the illusion in Europe? I don't see anything. I'm obviously a Eurosceptic, but I don't see what the attractive illusion is. We don't seem to have one, Slobodan.
Well, the illusion is it's the elephant in the room. It's the thing nobody sees. It's the thing called democracy, which does not exist at all. It doesn't exist at all. Not a single moment in the recent history of Europe. I mean, the EU history of part of the European history. We can discuss other things at national levels, but at a European level, it doesn't exist. The first thing that Alexander Zinoviev noticed, and to his amazement, when he landed in Munich in Germany in the 70s, And he wrote about that. He wrote a book called The Occidentism or Westernism. I don't know how it's translated into English. Zapadnism in Russian. He said, I was expecting to see...
Westernism.
The Westernism, yes, exactly. Yeah. He said, I was expecting to see more democracy, more power of expression and decision to the people in the West than in the Soviet Union. Whereas in the West, I saw a ritual, which was, you go to elect your MPs or whatever, a few times once a year. Here in Switzerland, we can go and vote about all sorts of things, except the most important ones. But in other countries, you would vote, you would elect a parliament, which would serve as a confirmation board for the decisions of the executive power, which which was subordinate to economic power or financial power. But he said, well, at a very basic citizens level, he said, in the Soviet Union, from where I came, you had a Soviet, a council in every institution, every plant, every hospital. In the hospital, the professors and doctors and surgeons had to go and listen to what the people had to tell them in those Soviets. And the floor cleaner had her word, although probably it was useless. But somebody would listen. Whereas in the Western societies, at any level, and that's the society, the sociological mind and logical mind of Zinoviev describing it, everything is a pyramid. Everything.
There is a quotation. I'm not sure whether it's true or apocryphal, and I believe it's Solzhenitsyn, who says, "We are living in your future. We are living in your future." I believe he said that in the 1970s, but I haven't been able to verify.
No. It's Bukovsky. You quoted him.
It's Bukovsky. It is Bukovsky. I'm sorry, I'm confusing. Yeah.
And the exact sentence is very funny. He said, "I used to live in your future. It didn't work."
Okay. So he wasn't being prophetic then. He already was talking about the then future in the past tense.
Yeah.
But there's another quotation I'd like to bring into this discussion, which you may not know, but which joins this idea of a future and a sort of a train track, if you like, of history. There's an English journalist, I'm not sure if his name means anything to you, called Malcolm Muggeridge, who went to Moscow in the 1930s, in the, I think, mid to late 1930s, as a communist. He went for The Guardian. And his story is one of disillusionment with Soviet communism. And he would send back reports, including about the various famines in southern Russia and Ukraine, which were not believed. He's one of those who saw through the system pretty early, even though, as I say, he went there as a believer. He didn't go there as an anti-communist. The Guardian, obviously, is a famous left-wing newspaper and has been for many generations. And he writes in his memoirs, admittedly, the memoirs are, I think, from the 70s, so maybe he's inventing his memory, but he writes this passage, which I've often quoted, and I'd like to quote again. He's in the Moscow metro in the 1930s, and he says, "I saw this mass of humanity surging through the metro, and I had the impression that this was humanity marching through the 20th century, that what was happening to them would soon happen to us. And so it has proved," I'm quoting from memory, "and so it has proved, the walls of Jericho have come crashing down without even a trumpet." And as I say, maybe he was embellishing his own vision 40 years later or whatever. But this firstly, the prophetic nature of it is remarkable, if indeed he did have that vision. But also this notion of humanity marching through the 20th century. Is there something ineluctable about this? are communism and liberalism, as I often say in my lectures, just two manifestations of the same thing, godless materialism, for example? And are we therefore simply just, being in the West, therefore being in the march of history, are we just naturally picking up from where the Eastern Europeans left off?
No, you're right. There is something. There is something at the same time of very common, universal, and a sense of doom. There is a sense of doom, and when you think deeper than political philosophies or political regimes, you touch down to the very nature of modernity, which is a machine. No, modernity is the dream of man of becoming a machine.
Exactly, and that's since at least the 18th century.
Yeah. So, in a way, the Soviet Union, first of all, the Bolshevik regime was, in its ideology, entirely imported from the West. We know that historically, the upper classes of Russian society, since the revolution of the so-called Decembrists in Decabristi, in the beginning of the 19th century, the upper classes were, I would say, infected, but they were very deeply influenced by the most advanced, if we may say, or the most nefarious, we can also say, ideologies of the West. So, intrinsically, this revolution is probably an experiment in Western ideology, but implanted on a soil that could more easily be adapted to it than the old, very structured and very individually organized Western societies. It was, although there was no proletarian class actually in Soviet Union, in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, it was easier to enforce a proletarian revolution there than you would have done it in Netherlands or in France. Or France, well, France is the origin of the whole thing, so let's put it aside. Or in Germany, or in Britain, because people had, they were old individualist societies. Russia was not like that. In Russia, the slaves, the serfs had been freed only 7 decades before the revolution, or 6 decades before the revolution, and the third generation of the liberated slaves was still not quite understanding that they were free and what to do with that freedom. That's a thing that even Tolstoy noted.
You're saying that the old Zemstvo tradition in Russia, the communitarian tradition, plus of course the long survival of serfdom, made it a fertile ground for communism. But as we know, Russia has now vomited it out again, as have, by the way, a number of Central European countries. Those countries which in 1968 and in 1956 rebelled against the Soviet system. I'm thinking, of course, of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And now we see Eastern European countries, generally speaking, rejecting the most obvious derivative forms of postmodern liberalism. If you think of an ideological map of Europe, the further east you go, the more conservative it becomes. The further west you go, the more liberal and progressive. So that old argument perhaps doesn't hold anymore, that somehow these communitarian societies were more receptive, or at least things have moved on. Perhaps it's, as Tocqueville said, we in the West have become so individualistic that we have nothing to bind us at all except the state and except the tutelary power of the state. Our antibodies, as I used the image earlier, seem to be much weakened with respect to Eastern Europe.
Yes. Well, structurally there was a difference, quite a difference between the Russian society and, for instance, Hungarian or Czech. Czech is Germany, more or less. The structure of families, structure of ownership, whatever. But let's go back to the basics. Russia has rejected communism, but the ideology, yes, but the legacy is still there. You still have the red star on every wing of every Russian plane. You still have the red star atop the Kremlin, which is quite curious. You still have people, and I know them for having spent time there, a lot of people who would not, allow us a word of criticism about the great patriotic war and its military leader, the comrade Stalin. As the President Putin said once, he said the creation of the Soviet Union was a great tragedy for Russia, but its dismantling was an even greater tragedy for Russia. And both things are true. So the Russians have integrated this, for bad or worse, for good or bad, I don't know, this legacy into their current culture, mindset. You have people like, Zakhar Prilepin, who is the very famous writer. He's a sort of what they call national Bolshevik. You can't define people like he's a Bolshevik, but he's national, and he's defending his church traditions and whatever, while still promoting the Bolshevik idea. So, the cards are reshuffled a bit, but basically the ideology has been identified and rejected, just as it has been in the other East European states. And this has as you noticed at the beginning, this has a long history. You probably know about this great famous Polish diplomat and writer Czesław Miłosz. Czesław Miłosz, he's really a great writer, and he wrote a book that is fundamental for understanding the totalitarian societies. It is the Enchained or Captive Mind. You know that.
Captive Mind, yeah, of course.
It's Captive Mind, yeah. And he not only describes the conditions of the censorship and alternative reality where the mind is forced to live in the Soviet system, but he also explains or describes the resistance strategies. In such a system, you're forced to make believe that you're in, although you're out. You're outside.
But again, Slobodan, the metaphor is very is perfect. The captive mind. He understood that the mind was captive. In the West, we have had since, I think it's 1985, Alan Bloom, the closing of the American mind. The closing. It's not a captive mind. It's a closing mind. That was already the case in 1985.
Certainly.
A few moments ago, you mentioned democracy. The Revolt of the Elites of Christopher Lasch is from 1995.
Exactly.
He describes there how the elites reject the people, how the elites have increasingly built up structures where they are the ones that decide and don't let the cleaning lady speak. In fact, don't let anybody else speak. These are firstly, very long-term, already a generation old, at least 10 trends. And they are not, unlike in the Soviet system, the result of captivity. They seem to be indigenous. You said Marxism was a Western ideology. I'm often struck by the verses in the Gospel, which say, where Jesus says at one point about a devil. He says, when a devil leaves a soul, it wanders around in arid places, and then when the soul has cleaned itself out, that he's left, the devil says, oh, I'll go back to that soul. It's been cleaned out. I'll go back and I'll take 7 devils with me. Well, that's what's happened with Marxism. It started in Paris and London, invented by an expatriate German from Trier, from the very west of Germany. And it then, of course, but it left Europe. It never took root. It went east, and then, not having found a home in the east, it's come back now with 7 more devils to a place that is even more ready to receive it than was Russia.
Yes, exactly.
Another overlap, or another dovetail, in terms of the Soviet EU similarity, is the highly sophisticated information control system, aka propaganda. I mean, both centralize information flow. And this is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
Except I completely agree, but it's much more sophisticated and much more pronounced. So what I mean by that is that, yes, the Soviet system jammed, Radio Free Europe and Western television stations. We now jam Russian broadcasts, RT, Sputnik, and so on. But
and also just pump out propaganda.
Yeah, exactly, and the propaganda is far worse. Is far worse, or at least, I think it is. I think it is certainly comparable, and in its reach, in its penetration, it's worse. Because, as I said a moment ago, people in the Soviet Union stopped believing it a long time ago. I worked for 10 years for a Russian lady whom you know, Natalia Narushnitskaya, and she described taking part in May Day parades. So she's a bit older than me, but this would have been probably in the 70s. She took part in May Day parades, and in the actual parade on Red Square, they would be making jokes about Lenin, and they would be doing competitions with each other about how to sing Leninist slogans in Orthodox chant and stuff like that. That was the reality. Okay, it might be happening now with Gen Z in Europe, with the sort of Nick Fuentes phenomenon, the desire to break down the taboos. But these taboos still retain a very, very great power, I would say, over Western European societies. And unlike, we say the Soviet Union and it collapsed and so on, I personally think that the collapse of the Western system, although of course it has many fragilities, is still some way off, because the system has a lot of life left in it and it knows how to strike back.
Yes, I would say that the propaganda and brainwashing system in the West is much more organic. It's not, I would not agree that it is centralized. It is intertwined. It is a network.
Hold on. How can? So I'm trying to wrap my head around how is propaganda then, if not centralized? How can propaganda be? Then what is it? Decentralized? But how is that possible?
There is an ideological consensus that is being implemented in the elites' minds from the school on, about what can be thought and said and what cannot. And they just apply this system of permissions and restrictions wherever they are. I'll give you an example. That it's not my example. It was quoted long ago by oh God, I forget names. Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky said, he did a sort of survey of the American press in the 70s, looking for one word in the American press. To compare it with the Soviet system, he said when the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan, the Soviet armies entered Afghanistan. It was at the beginning of 1982 or 1.
I thought it was 79. I thought it was
79. Yes, 79, yeah. 79. There was an anchor at the on the national radio who said that morning, comrades, we'll be told stories about our brotherly help to the people of Afghanistan, but actually we're just occupying a neighboring country. We are occupants. It was his last broadcast, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. All right, he did it. And taking this example, Noam Chomsky sent his students to look for the word occupation in the mainstream press and media of the United States related to Vietnam. Not a single occurrence. Nobody thought they were occupying Vietnam. So if this ideology, or if this item, this slogan, we are spreading freedom in Southeast Asia, were imposed from above, somebody would have thought, well, it's okay, it's a bullshit. I'll tell the truth. Nobody did. And as Chomsky commented, finally, he said, but what did an American journal risk for saying we are occupying Vietnam? Nothing. No psychiatry. No colonies. No gulags. Nothing. Maybe he would have gone to some other outlet or changed profession. Well, okay, change profession. You become an advertiser or whatever. But nobody did. So that's why I say it's completely organic. And that's why it is much, much more dangerous. And they are still not seeing the thing right now. And I'm afraid here in Europe, the so-called ruling elites will not see the tsunami wave until they drown.
But if it's organic, that means it's exponentially more dangerous because it's a lot more subtle.
Certainly. Soviet communist societies after 1989, they switched like this. Poland, nothing remained. Hungary, nothing remained. But we in Western Europe will have to deal with our illusions for generations. They will just go around and complain how reality offended their preconceptions. Well, reality is the culprit. Reality is guilty.
I think Jerem's questions are excellent, because it's indeed difficult to understand how something so powerful can be organic. I may have mentioned him before, but there's a really remarkable philosopher or political commentator who writes under the name of N.S. Lyons. I don't know whether it's his real name. And some years ago, he wrote a long essay, which is available online, called The China Convergence. It's an absolutely brilliant essay. Brilliant. Quite long. It's on Substack, but it's free on access. And one of the many brilliant points he makes, the argument is that we are converging with what we imagine China to be. In other words, a highly controlled, essentially totalitarian society. But one of the points he makes, Jerm, answers your question. And it's this. It's that there can be systems which spontaneously generate their own taboos. So the taboos can, as it were, come from below. And the way this happens is that taboos or ideologies, being instruments of power, because ideology is nothing but an instrument of power, people who want to get on in life, they want to please the boss, they want to be accepted by society, they know what signals to give off, they know what things to say, because the system will welcome things which reinforces the power of the system and will expel things which tend to weaken the power of the system. But those things can be generated independently of the system, and the system will either accept.
Can you give an example, John? I'm fascinated.
Well, I mean, almost any politically, I don't have a concrete example in mind, but almost any politically correct statement or any statement about, I don't know, climate change or any of the fashionable nostrums, people will make those statements and advance those arguments or more importantly, propose, I don't know, reports or research products or initiatives or whatever on the basis of allegations or claims or arguments which tend to reinforce the system, and the system will of course be happy to accept them if they reinforce the power of the system, and will concomitantly expel them if they tend to weaken them. So for example, in COVID,
it sounds like populism. Yeah, it's a bit like populism then.
No. It's just, I was going to say, it's more like in COVID, where any dissident voices, people who had a critical view or thought about things or questioned the narrative, they were, of course, expelled by the system, because the system, by which I mean the state control, the desire to impose ever stricter measures and so on, was strengthened by the narrative, by the official narrative, and weakened by dissident narratives. But those narratives were not necessarily all generated from on high. They were also, just as in a company, if you're working in a company, I repeat, you want to please your boss. So you will come up with ideas that you think your boss will like. And if he thinks that, yes, it'll make more money or make the company more famous or whatever, he will accept them. That's what I mean by it not being centrally decided.
So I apologize for invoking this, but could it be the case that Hitler's rise was organic and therefore spontaneous, like you're talking about?
Well, I think within the Nazi system, of course, that, by the way, is often said by students of Nazism, that it was structurally very chaotic, and Hitler encouraged the various branches of power to compete with each other. There wasn't, in fact, in that sense, a central direction. This goes back, by the way, to a very old element of Prussian military strategy developed during the Napoleonic Wars, where the Prussian units were encouraged to take a lot of liberty, providing that, of course, they all went and achieved the same goal. And this, by the way, this notion of fixing the goal, but allowing people to decide for themselves how to achieve it, which, as I say, survived and then flourished again under Nazism. It survived from the Prussian times, was, by the way, it's rather amusing, then recycled later after the war into management theory. There are quite a lot of, there's one particularly savory story of a man who founded a management school in West Germany and built it up, and it became very famous until 20 or 30 years after his career, he turned out he'd been an SS officer, a very senior SS officer. And so in a way, he'd been, if you like, applying these theories to the theory of management. But yes, so you can say that of the Nazi regime, to the extent that, as it's well known, that Hitler did encourage this sort of competition and indeed rivalry, severe rivalry between the various parts of the regime.
And John, you could easily set up another conversation about the National Socialist heritage in the EU. It would be just as relevant as the Bolshevik one.
Well, I wrote a book about that in 1997.
So I was hinting. And concerning the German model, I often say that if you had told a German who had voted for Hitler in 1933, if you had described him, what he himself and his family and friends would become in 1942, he would just have bought you a beer. He would have said, "No, you're joking. We are the most educated people in the world. We are actually liberal. We have welfare. With Hitler brought, he restored the welfare. He restored security, built motorways, made the Volkswagen. He pleased people actually, and they saw no evil. They saw no evil." But
again,
gradually,
the contrast is surely overwhelming, Slobodan, between those regimes, and of course Italian fascism is another example where the Duce, the leader, plays the dominant role and indeed dominates the entire political scene with considerable panache, by the way, huge parades and banners and music and songs and all the rest of it. Triumphalism, triumphal propaganda. We don't have any of that. That's why I asked you earlier about the illusion. We don't have any of that. We have a rather limp, the banner, the stars. Where's the illusion? Where's the vision? It's very different. We don't have a political vision. That was a political vision, for good or ill, a clearly identifiable one, identified with one man, the leader, and so on. We have instead this totally disembodied, anonymous, post-everything, post-modern, it can't even be defined, it's so post-modern. That's what I find so arresting about the current situation.
It's because we don't have an ideological illusion, but we have a functional necessity. That's what I was talking about earlier. Europe, in the aftermath of World War II, has produced an insufficient number of engineers, but an overwhelming quantity of lawyers. We, lawyers, administrators, bureaucrats, and all sorts of basically superfluous professions in the social sciences and stemming from humanities studies. These people had to be settled somewhere. We built structures for them to be employed. And becoming a European MP when you're from Romania or Greece or Bulgaria is like, receiving, the Euro-Million prize. So it works functionally, not even ideologically. The function is satisfying a class of useless people with bullshit jobs. That's why it's dead. That's why it's dead.
Yep, that's exactly right. It's a sort of dysfunctional functionalism.
Yeah.
But you're quite right. That's part of our whole departure from reality. This is a point which Emmanuel Todd makes in The Defeat of the West, La défaite de l'Occident.
Yeah.
That we don't have engineers, we don't have a real economy. This goes back to what's his name, who wrote The Anywheres and the Somewheres. David, I've forgotten his name. He's a British, very intelligent British journalist.
Yeah.
Anyway, that clearly is one of the problems that we, as you say, we have. But again, the Americans have that as well. The Americans have far too many lawyers. They probably have more lawyers than we do, and they have very few engineers. And yet they somehow seem to be on a very different trajectory right at the moment. What do you think of that, Slobodan? Last comment.
I'm not sure. There is a the MAGA party, which is sort of reaction, but what has it obtained? A civil war in every major city in the United States, and you have the how do you say, the parasite classes, the useless. Well, not the useless. I would say the new elites of a bureaucratic system revolting against that. They're not revolting because of the treatment of migrants or the black people. No, they're revolting for their own position, their own privileges. when you have people like, bullies like Elon Musk, shouting and promising that he will do with the state what he did with Twitter, means removing 80% of superfluous jobs, it's a declaration of war, and that's what they got. So how are they going to get on with that? If they manage to re-industrialize America quickly, it will work. If they don't, it won't.
So they were revolting.
Yeah.
Did my pun go over?
Yeah. Very good. On that pun, on that revolting pun, we will wind up. Slobodan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been
thank
wonderful
you, John.
listening
Thank
to
you, John.
And we hope to have you on again at some point in the future. Thanks ever so much to everyone for watching. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.